you'd be fucking hard pressed to think of too many people who are more warmly ensconced in the Washington establishment than George Will. Over the span of 48 years at the Washington Post, George Will has authored some 6,000 or so columns during 10 different presidencies. He won a Pulitzer Prize and written 16 books. His latest, American Happiness and Discontent, is coming out this week. For at least a generation, he has been the most prominent intellectual conservative voice in mainstream media. So he's so well known that he was once the topic of a joke on Seinfeld. A week prior to President-elect Barack Obama's inauguration, George Will hosted the Illinois senior senator, for dinner and had him drink from a cup that once belonged to Abraham Lincoln. Dinner with George Will was the ultimate outsider's welcome to Washington that few could give a similar establishment approval, improved imprimatur, and yet in 2021, George Will, in some ways, is a man on the outside looking in. Yes, he still has one of the most prominent columns in one of the world's most powerful newspapers, and yes, he is still part of the Washington scene. But politics have changed, and the intellectual conservatism he embodies is without an obvious political home. The Trump years, basically, Will told Politico in an interview this week, made me realize that conservatism was a label that could be hijacked. Conservatism to George Will is a whole ethos with a proud intellectual tradition in American life, and what it means to conserve, he says, is the American founding. That's conservatism, George Will said, and along goes Trump, who says no conservatism is beating up on the Mexicans or whatever the hell he fucking says. And now what society thinks of as conservatism is different. To Will, this is not unlike the trend of self-identified conservative evangelical Christians who identify basically based not in scripture but in cultural totems. In one fucking sense, yes, they're Christians, but in another, what does that term really mean if divorced from scripture? And what does conservative mean in politics anyway, as Will describes it? And it's now cut off from anything other than making one's adherents feel good. To Will, this is a fundamental change in what society understands politics to fucking be. Grievances which multiply like fucking rabbits and cause people to be constantly furious are very difficult to address with politics, and it's understood as legislation and policy. Will said, if people feel condensed, to how do you write a bill and take care of condensation, it's very hard to address, which is why politics becomes sort of cut from the normal stuff of politics. And what do you do politically? I don't get it. Will is introspective about how we got here, yet there are some easy and obvious targets that sped up the decline of American political discourse. He cites social media that is often high-velocity lunacy and vituperation, I'm not sure how you say that, if I'm not saying that right, and just plain ugliness. And later he volunteers that he doesn't use Twitter, but if someone said tweet or I'll kill you, I'm fucking done. But there's also a not insubstantial role that conservative intellectuals themselves played in stoking the fires of conservative populism. After the Second World War, when conservatism began to grow, it was an extremely bookish persuasion. And Will said, and the name-checking thinkers like William F. Buckley and Milton Friedman and Russell Kirk. And as the Republican Party became the party of ideals, that which they really aren't, that necessarily put a target on their backs, overturning the so-called Republican establishment meant overturning the bookish side of it and overturning the intellectual side of it, Will said. But none of which is to say that George Will has gone moderate. He hasn't. He thinks government does far too fucking much, and spends far too much fucking time, and that politics occupies far too much of the national, what they call mental bandwidth. He's just upset about some of the same things that animate other conservatives, like the New York Times 1619 Project. But he's also critical of those conservatives who want to airbrush the past. And there's something fucking wrong there and basically he's lived 80 years. He's benefited from the wonderful institutions of higher education. And basically he said in his 80th year, I learned about the Tulsa riots, Will said, and there was something wrong there. I should have known about that. That wasn't just erasure. That was a pogrom. And what does American conservatism mean in 2021? And how did George Will hear about the Tulsa massacre, and what is his advice for those vying to replace Donald Trump? To talk through all that and more, Political Magazine talked to Will via Zoom. A transcript of that conversation follows here, and it's condensed and edited for length and readability because it was a long thing. Basically, he said, I wanted to read to you something that you wrote in 1976, a nation that feels a democratic imperative to celebrate the lowest common denominator sooner or later, and will get the lowest common denominator everywhere, including its legislators. The empty-headed celebration of the common man will produce many leaders who are, to be polite, common. And do you think we are seeing the lowest common denominator right now in our legislators and in our politics? Basically, Will says, oh, you're too fucking optimistic with the word lowest. You're forgetting Will's first law, which is, there is no such thing as fucking rock bottom. What I was saying was Tocquevillian. He worried about this, but also I was saying that this at a time when Jimmy Carter was running for president and making a big deal of the fact that he carried his own suitcase to show what a regular guy he fucking was. I didn't quote it at the time because I hadn't yet come upon it, but someone once said to Senator Robert Taft's wife, "Is your husband a common man?" She said, "Good God, no." Even though there is no God anyway, but first in his class at Yale, and first in his class in law school, the people of Ohio don't want a common man, and in fact we don't. Jimmy Carter also, to his credit, said, "Why not the best?" It was one of his slogans, because we really don't want common people, we want the uncommon. Over the last few years, as we saw the rise of Trumpism, it's that a whole strain of politics because, as you suggested, we celebrated the common man too much, or because the common man feels ignored by institutions, and that makes it easier to play the politics of grievance. Yes, which is to say fucking both, but there's no question that people feel ignored, and there's no question that we have to uncritically said the populist trope, which is that people know what they want, and that people are wise, and they therefore ought to get what they want, instead of H.L. Mencken's famous belief that democracy is the conviction that people know that they want and deserve to get good and hard. But there's a third factor nowadays, and that is social media, which gives velocity to appetites and passions that are unnatural. It's also the case that when the mainstream media was everything, that sort of offended our democratic sensibilities, but it had the advantage that there were gatekeepers. So if you're stark raving mad and overflowing with conspiracy theories, it was pretty hard to disseminate it now. Now it's easy. Jane Bullock, who runs the Bullock Conspiracy website and teaches law at UCLA, has written a wonderful speech on the cost of cheap speech, which is often high-velocity lunacy and just plain ugliness. The bad old days had something to be said for them. How do we balance, basically, the embrace of the free speech, which is the bedrock an American ideal? And it was a bedrock American ideal for the last 60 years. Almost all the jurisprudential thinking about the free speech clause of the First Amendment has been to justify balancing free speech against competing values, communitarian values, etc. So it's far from the bedrock American value that we basically remember. Now, particularly on college campuses where you would have thought free speech was safe. In fact, what's most protected on campuses nowadays is freedom from fucking speech. And let's dig further into this. In your book, you're right. In George Will's book, basically, it's written that America's most dispiriting intellectual phenomenon is the degradation of higher education. And what's behind this? There has always been some degree of culture war over academia and its place in society, but it seems like over the last few decades, it has morphed into something different. It took 800 years of the evolution of the great research universities through thickets it looks like ecclesiastical or whatever the fuck you say it, and political interference to get to where they came from, and it becomes a great ornament of Western civilization, and it can take about one generation to kick all that away. Now, part of the problem is that a lot of the radicals in the 1960s went to work on campus and they got tenure, and through the tenure system, they reproduced themselves. There are a lot of people on campus nowadays who just don't belong there, and they shouldn't be teachers, they should be political activists. Fucking fine. But go out and do your thing, but don't pretend that you're going to be teachers. And this isn't just on campuses alone. There's a common academic culture from Harvard Graduate School to kindergarten in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's spread across the country as evenly as honey on toast, and it affects everything. Everyone is an activist nowadays. The head of the Los Angeles Teachers Union recently said that all this business is about learning loss during the pandemic is nonsense. So your children, your babies, she said, so your babies don't know their timetables. They learn the meaning of the word insurrection and coup, but oh fucking please, that's not what they're supposed to learn on third grade. And there's a monochrome ideological culture on campus, often enforced through cultural signs in the name of diversity. And diversity in everything but thought. Now on campuses, it's the classy to be conservative. You're not just mistaken in your beliefs, you're somehow vulgar, and it's this sense of condescension to the vulgarians that infuses a certain high-octane bitterness into our politics these days. One of the striking things to me about our politics is that the grievances, which multiply like rabbits, and cause people to be constantly furious, are very difficult to address for politics, understood as legislation and policy. I mean, if people feel condensed to how do you write a bill and take care of condescension, it's very hard to address, which is why politics becomes sort of cut off from the normal stuff of politics. Donald Trump says these people despise you and we should despise them. What do you do politically? I don't fucking get that. Trump didn't have any success, but basically the thing says, did the success of Donald Trump make you reconsider what you thought of as conservative? No. He says, it made me realize that conservatism was a label that could be hijacked, but no, conservatism, by golly, it is what it is. In my last book before this one, The Conservative Sensibility, the common question is, and it's a good one, was, what does conservatives want to conserve? The answer is the American founding, which is basically three things. First, there is a constant human nature that we are not just creatures who acquire the impress of whatever culture we're situated in. Second, there are natural rights. That is essential to the flourishing of creatures of our constant human nature. And third, governments are, the Declaration said, instituted to secure the most important word in the Declaration, those rights, which is to pre-exist government, and the structure of government must be such that, in our Madisonian way, government is strong enough to protect the rights, but not strong enough to threaten our rights. And that's conservatism. And along comes Mr. Trump, who says no, conservatism is beating up the Mexicans, or whatever the fuck he says. But this brings to mind a conversation that I had earlier this year with the devout Christian. That's the guy that's writing the article here, who expressed alarm at the number of people who self-identified as evangelical Christians, but whose ideal of what that means is entirely cultural instead of being rooted in Scripture. It feels like you're describing something similar with Trump, and that there are self-identified conservatives whose ideal of what conservatism means is entirely based on cultural identity and cultural grievances instead of those tenets of conservatism as a philosophy. Do you think that this is a fair? Do you think that it's a fair comparison? I think it is. Donald Trump is the purest expression of the current pandemic of performative of politics. Politics cut off from anything other than making one's adherents feel good. And people nowadays feel good by disliking the other team. Long ago, when Will was a child in the world and basically with the world, he basically mentioned that there was a radio program called Fibber, McGee, and Molly. And Molly would say to her husband, Fibber, if it makes you happy to be unhappy, then be unhappy. A lot of people are only happy when they're unhappy now. It makes them feel alive to define themselves, not in terms of positive affirmations, but of hostilities, and I don't know what to do about it. Personal matters, that is, who's up and who's down in politics. One of the things we've learned from Donald Trump is the enormous capacity of one individual to alter the tone of our civic life. You can't unring the bell, and you can't just unsay the things that he said, and every fucking word that he said had consequences. However, you can get someone to ring a different fucking bell, and it's not easy for people who are not demagogues to have that kind of dramatic effect that a demagogue can have. But I do think someone with Eisenhower's smile or Reagan's struggle would make a big difference. If someone came along and said, "Really, now calm down, deep breaths," I think the country would be so ready for it. Now let's ask. Basically the guy asked Will about something that he wrote back in 1976. The best history is distinguished by an awareness that there is so much more to the lives of nations than the free decisions of politicians and electorates. And what do you think that we're missing or ignoring right now as we survey the life of our nation and focus on Trumps and the ups and downs of the day? We'll go from the small to the more particular. The small is the swollen presidency. Presidents were magnified first by radio, which I think probably had a bigger effect on politics, particularly in Germany. In the 1920s and 30s, then television has had become, and then television has had because it gave an immediacy to strong figures. But because of the modern technologies, radio, television, and now the internet and all that, the presidents are ubiquitous. They're in our living rooms at all times. Michael Jackson dies, and the president is supposed to say something. How did that happen? The president is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. He is definitely secondary to those who make the laws that he has to see that are faithfully executed. The swollen presidency is part of this. It permeates us. That's partly because famously the United States doesn't distinguish head of government from the head of state the way the British did. The British could push all that ceremonial stuff on the House of Windsor, let them do it, and then let the Prime Minister Boris Johnson embody the national spirit. That's at the pinnacle of it. The conspicuousness of the head of the executive branch. And flowing from that is an excessive belief that politics undermines happiness, whereas in fact, what makes America so interesting and so creative, and what explains the fecundity of American freedom, is the spontaneous order, to use a good Hayekian concept that is so creative and rich. It's a version of what the Tocqueville marveled at. An amazing American genius for creating intermediate institutions. You know, the wagon trains would head out from St. Joseph, Missouri, and about the first night they'd circle the wagons, and they would start electing officers. That's just the way we are, and it's the bottom up richness of American life that gets eclipsed when we focus instead on senators. When Franklin Roosevelt sat down to deliver his first fireside chat, the first words he spoke, which are not on the text up at Hyde Park, were, "My friends, now imagine." Now imagine George Washington saying, "My friends, it's inconceivable. Calvin Coolidge, never, no, no. I'm not your friend, I'm your employee, frankly." But people loved it. This is my friend, and we've been intimate with these guys ever since. Basically, so to be a glib about it, there's a direct line one can draw from FDR to Trump. Oh no, laughs Roosevelt, understood that the nation was demoralized, and he understood that people had this staticky, crackling, large gadget called a radio in their living rooms, and it changed everything. He understood that. It's part of his genius plan. No one said FDR was a common man. He was a genuine American aristocrat, but he had the common touch. When we look back at how the conservative elite had talked about populism in the past, William F. Buckley famously said that he'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than the first 2,000 names in the Harvard faculty, and it had the very least tinges of anti-intellectualism, and it shares the trait with what happened on the right during the rise of Trump, and with the notable change being that the intellectual conservative elite was overthrown by the very intellectual populists that they glorified. Do you think that that's an accurate way to think of this? I do, after the Second World War, when conservatism began to grow and then began to refute Lionel Trillin's famous statement in the liberal imagination that there is no conservative thought in America, only irritable gestures which seek to resemble ideas. It was an extremely bookish persuasion. Richard Weaver's ideas have consequences. Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind. Bill Buckley's Up from Liberalism. Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. Bookish people, it was to the point. That the man who became his best friend, the best thing that he had in 50 years in Washington was getting to know Pat Moynihan, and that was back in the 1970s. That something momentous has happened, and the Republican Party has become the party of ideas and not anymore. To overturn the so-called Republican establishment had meant overturning the bookish side of it and overturning the intellectual side of it, and it's natural, if disreputable, that populism would say, enough of these ideas, we want passions. Basically, George Bull was asked, does he think of himself as part of the establishment? And basically, he paused and says, let me give you two answers. People are always talking about the Republican establishment. I tend to think the Republican establishment died at the Cow Palace in San Francisco in the summer of 1964. And when they decided to stop Barry Goldwater and they said, Bill Scranton, come on down, there was an establishment up to that point. They had a newspaper, the New York Herald Tribune. They had a bank, Chase. They had the Rockefeller brothers. They had Bill Scranton. It was an establishment, and Goldwater beat them. The Herald Tribune died, as I recall, in April of 1966, and it hasn't been quite the same since. And with that being said, the phrase Republican establishment is a little bit like Secretary of State Antony Blinken talking about the international community, as though that phrase actually denoted something. Rwanda and Denmark, I mean, what are we talking about here? But on the other hand, look, I've been in Washington for 50 some years. I love Washington. It's my home now. I'm a Washingtonian. He basically Will says he loves the monuments. He loves driving around the city and seeing them. And I suppose in some sense, someone who appears regularly in the hometown newspaper and in a few hundred others as part of the establishment is fucking guilty. Basically, he was asked, you've alluded to these fights that happen at universities over history, like the 1619 Project, which you read about in the book, and then in the 1776 Commission that the Trump convened. Are these fights really just about competing visions of patriotism and history? And conservative patriotism also often has this sense of great noble national history and belief that we need to live up to the glories of the past. And while the democratic patriotism to some degree is about overcoming the inequities of the past and about a history of American getting better and breaking free of the past through struggle and activism. Yeah, Professor Stephen Smith of Yale had published a book recently on patriotism. He is not a conservative, but he says that there is a kind of aspirational patriotism by progressives. They say, we love America because we think someday it's going to be worth our love, and that won't do, and that just won't be, that fucking won't be enough. And just as it won't do for conservative patriotism to airbrush the past. There is something wrong there's something wrong that basically George Will had said that he lived in his 80 years, he benefited from wonderful institutions of the higher educations, and in his 80th year, we get down to the Tulsa riots, and there was something wrong there. Basically, I should have known about the Tulsa riots, but I didn't. Basically, he was asked about how did he learn about Tulsa. Around the anniversary, the centennial of it, some of the papers were doing what journalism should do, which is to write not just about the future, but not about the past. And not just about the past, and it was healthy. I vaguely heard about it, but I had no idea, and it should have come to my attention. Orwell said in 1984 that he who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls who controls the present controls the past. And when we argue about history, we're arguing about the future. And when we argue against the 1619 Project, we're arguing against it because it is fundamentally preposterous. The sense of it is expressed by Nicole Hannah Jones, who won a Pulitzer Prize. Not just that America was really founded in 1619 with the rebel slaves, but the American Revolution was fought to defend slavery because Lord Dunmore had promised that slaves who escaped and joined the British side would be emancipated. And while by the time Dunmore talked, Lexington and Concord had already occurred. The Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party had all occurred. George Washington had been appointed commander of the army. All of this before that, and there's a deep, almost cynical illiteracy about the 1619 Project. The revolution was about big stuff. Read Bernard Bailyn. Read Gordon Wood. People took their ideas seriously. We had a rich newspaper culture and a rich pamphlet culture. How many things published in America have sold comparable to the proportion of the population? Anything like Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Basically, since George Will said he doesn't use Twitter, basically he says, basically he was asked about Twitter. He said, I never look at Twitter, and he doesn't tweet. He says, I don't know how to tweet. If someone said tweet or I'll kill you, I'm done. Someone on my staff tweets from my columns twice a week. That's it. I'm told I have a Facebook page, but he's never seen it. Basically, he was asked, do you feel like you're missing out? He says, I know exactly what I'm missing, and and he says he's delighted that he's missing it. He's been writing for the Washington Post since 1973, 48 years. He's wrote 6,000 columns or so. And what do you get out of writing? And is it different at this point in your life than it was when you first started? Basically, he said that when he first started, it was intense, almost a tactical pleasure out of putting sentences together. He says he has a metabolic urge to write. I think a lot of writers hate to write, but they like hanging out in the journalistic subculture, and they like seeing their name in print at the end. But the actual writing itself is painful. Red Smith, the great sports writer, said that there's nothing to writing. You just open a vein and you bleed it. I think that's nuts. I can think of nothing more fun than having to write anything. And is it true that even when the subject matter itself isn't necessarily fun? And yes, that is true to some people. I think the columns I write today are generally more complicated than they used to be. Basically, George Will wrote a lot more about legal briefs and Supreme Court issues and all, so it's a little bit more demanding, but that's part of the fun. He's got 750 words to make clear to people why they ought to be concerned about this, and not just as the news of the day, but because in that news there is a nugget to principle that this is a larger and timeless. The majority of Americans don't read newspapers anymore, and the majority of the minority who do read newspapers probably don't read the op-ed columns and pages and columns. A lot of people say that's kind of depressing. No, it's liberating. We have a small but selective audience, a self-selected audience, basically, and it is demonstrably, it seems to me, intellectually upscale. And it is demonstrably, it seems to me, like the upscale thing, and because they are interested, that they have acquired knowledge. So you don't need to use many of your 750 words to reinvent the wheel. Every day saying that there are three branches of government, etc. They've got that. You can write obliquely and with intonation and make the most of your 750 words. And this is the last one. What in your mind are the most meaningful differences in your politics that are now compared to when you started writing for the Post? Basically, he says absence of friendships. I guess I'd say it's a good question. People were friendlier. They didn't get so lathered up. One of the nice things about about when he turned 80, I'm looking for the other ones, as you say. What was it that had me so lathered up during the Carter administration? Can I remember? No. A sense of perspective descends on you, and you can take a deep breath. And that's really it. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And thanks for listening.